Honor for me to introduce my colleague and friend, Alexandra Perisic, to talk about her many accomplishments and to prepare you for the awesomeness that is her newly published book, Precarious Crosses, Immigration, Neoliberalism, and the Atlantic, published by the Ohio University Press. Just recently, it's hot off the presses. It's actually one of the most prestigious presses for the type of work that Alexandra does. Originally from Belgrade, via Paris, France, Alexandra holds a PhD in French and Comparative Literature from Columbia University, where she also received a BA in Comparative Literature and Mathematics. That explains some stuff, but not all. And an MA in French and a Master's of Philosophy in French and Comparative Literature. She has worked at the University of Miami's Department of Modern Languages and Literature since the fall of 2014. And during her time at UM, she has published a lot. 7 single-authored essays in prominent peer-reviewed journals, 1 co-authored book chapter, 2 single-authored introductions, 1 to a special issue of a journal on pedagogy, and the other to the Serbian translation of Aimé Césaire's Discourse on Colonialism. An important and lengthy interview with author René de Pestres, published in an excellent peer-reviewed French journal, Siècle 20 ans. And now, the book she's presenting today. But these are facts that you can easily read in her CV. I'd like to offer 2 other facts that those of us who have had the privilege of working with her this past 5 years know about her and deeply admire. The first important fact you should know about Alexandra is that she's one of those rare, true polyglots. In addition to her native Serbian, she commands perfectly French, English, and Spanish. She's proficient in Portuguese and Haitian Creole. And I believe she dabbles in Italian. You know? This is important because her unique educational and personal background, combined with her command of several languages, enables Alexandra to make a very persuasive argument in her book in favor of a multinational, multilingual, and decentered approach to the study of literary texts that have been, up to now, read within predefined national frameworks. Her book changes all of this. I don't think you cannot work on the topic of migration anymore in the way that we have been doing in monolingual spaces after this book. The second important fact that you should know about Alexandra is that she is one of those amazing people who can combine committed worldly activism with erudite academic work. Alexandra's advocacy work combating the worldwide debt and precarity provoked by unbridled neoliberal financial forces lies at the core of her book, aptly titled Precarious Crossings. Her further commitment to pedagogical advocacy, community outreach, and service learning resonates not only in this brilliant work, but also in her excellent, effective, and affecting pedagogy. Alexandra's book is groundbreaking because it contributes very significantly to a reconfiguration of French and Francophone studies by transforming the way scholars in that field think about so-called Francophone literature. That is, it convincingly shifts Francophone studies from a narrowly understood post-colonial studies approach to a transcultural, multilingual, transdisciplinary, multimodal geographical approach. This book shifts the focus of studying literature of migration from what so far have been the privileged academic areas of attention, French and English post-colonial text, to other points of geographical and linguistic interest that include the Caribbean, Africa, Latin America, and the USA. From the dominance of studying just the effects and history of French and British colonialism to more contemporary global economic forces that, although continuing to be marked by forms of colonialism, have moved to other locations and other linguistic traditions. In addition to managing brilliant analysis of literary texts in French, Spanish, and English, and within their literary traditions, understanding them perfectly, Alexandra dialogues with an impressive array of thinkers, including philosophers, political economists, social scientists, and cultural critics. The level of erudition and interdisciplinarity, and serious interdisciplinarity, not like sort of speaking to the sort of, or just superficial interdisciplinarity, but she really knows these fields. So, as I said, the level of erudition and interdisciplinarity of this book is impressive. But Alexandra wears her knowledge lightly. and has managed to write an academic book that is eminently readable and approachable, thus truly tearing down the myth of academic writing as cryptic and also an elitist. As an activist, Alexandra transmits through this book a sense of urgency to the study of literature. She demonstrates beautifully that literature can help us to understand the world and its crisis in a way that can also encourage action, change, and activism. This book demonstrates why the type of humanistic study we conduct in the departments of literature and in humanist departments in general is more relevant now than ever. So please prepare to be awed by this excellent book and help me welcome it, Alexandra.
Thank you, Hema, for what was a very generous introduction. I'm not sure I can live up to that introduction. Actually, during it, I was thinking maybe we should just let Hema speak. But okay. So thank you all for coming on Wednesday evening. And this is my first book, so it's particularly exciting. So I wanted. I'm going to try to not talk too much. I just wanted to talk a little bit about the main ideas of the book and the main questions that were of interest to me. And then I will read a few very short paragraphs from the introduction. So in the book, I look at contemporary transatlantic immigration narratives written in French, Spanish, and English. So it's a mix, it's a very wide corpus of authors from the Caribbean, Africa, and Latin America who work on very contemporary immigration. And my argument is really twofold. So on the one hand, the immigrant trajectories in these novels no longer follow the post-colonial route. So they're no longer necessarily linking the former colonized to the former colonizer. And in the context of Francophone works, which were my point of departure, it means that authors are sending their characters beyond France to places including Spain, South Africa, Mexico, and so on and so forth. And so what was interesting to me were all of these new Atlantic connections that were emerging from these narratives and the way these authors were remapping the Atlantic space. But also, and this is the second part of the argument, in traveling beyond the more familiar post-colonial route, the authors in my corpus are shifting their focus from questions of cultural difference and national belonging to precarity. And precarity, which I define as a condition characterized by a lack of economic and social stability and protection, right? And precarity is sort of represented as a shared characteristic under global neoliberalization. And I'll spend some time explaining what I mean by global neoliberalization and why I use it as a connecting term. So in other words, unlike in many immigrant narratives of the 1980s and 1990s, questions of diversity, multiculturalism, assimilation, and integration within a specific national framework are no longer at the forefront. I mean, they're still there, but a whole new set of question is entering the conversation, notably certain economic questions, including debt, the environment, the global war on terrorism. And these are thought across various national settings. So one of the things that was interesting to me in studying these narratives was, first of all, how they challenged the unstated Eurocentric assumption that immigration begins once immigrants have arrived to their place of destination, right? And that only the global north has to, quote unquote, deal with increasing global immigration. So what we see a lot in these narratives is how contemporary immigration often involves several stages. So immigration from rural to urban centers and to regional neighbors often precedes immigration to the global north. And why is this important? Well, because while discussions around multiculturalism, diversity, natural immigration policies, are extremely important, especially given the rise of the extreme right in the United States and Europe, and I'm not saying they're not, but they're not sufficient, because to a certain extent they deal with the consequences but not the causes of immigration. So what I try to say is that global neoliberalization as a political, economic, and ideological system should be part of the conversation because neoliberalism and immigration are intertwined. And so what I look at is really how the narratives underline the contradictions inherent in neoliberalism as an ideology, and also how they invite us to think beyond neoliberalism as the only model. And there's really, to me, there's sort of two interconnected questions that I tried to answer in the book. And the first one is more of a disciplinary question. And it's the fact that I think that we need new theoretical frameworks to think about these narratives. So in a way that these narratives exceed the categories we normally operate within, such as Francophone literature, or Latin American literature, or post-colonial literature, right? And so within that context, I propose a multilingual framework within the context of the globalized Atlantic. But then there is a second part of the question which is also very important to me and which goes beyond the discipline of comparative literature. And that is, what is the role of comparative literature in the age of global neoliberalization, right? What can comparative literature do to us in this day and age? And I firmly believe, and I try to show this in the book, that comparison is really an imperative political project, right? Why? Because it enables us to reignite multilingual and multiracial conversations throughout the global South. And that this is something that we really need in what I call the age of global neoliberalization. Okay, so since now I've used this term 7 times, I have to point it. Okay, there you go. So, what do I mean by global neoliberalization? Okay, well, in the book I offer a much longer historical account of how neoliberalism has become the dominant system since basically the 1970s, but I'm not going to give you the full history here because it's long. But I will share with you one of the definitions of neoliberalism that I rely on, which comes from Wendy Brown's Undoing the Demos Neoliberalism Stealth Revolution. And I will let you read it for yourselves. Okay. So what does she mean by this? Well, basically, in the neoliberal era, the primary and sole purpose of the government is to enhance economic growth. And all other concerns, except for national security, are secondary. So values such as equality, liberty, inclusion have become subordinate to capital enhancement, and social justice and equality are pursued only to the extent that they support and encourage economic growth. Right? So they are valued if they attract consumers and investors, but no longer in their own right. Basically meaning that the model of the market is becoming the predominant model. And I should say that a lot of people talk about neoliberal globalization, and I actually use the term global neoliberalization, which is a little bit clunkier. But, of course, when people use neoliberal globalization is really to underline the fact that, globalization, this is not the first time we're living in a global era, right? And, the economy has been global for a very long time, and different national spaces have been politically and, economically connected for a very long time. Now, I decided to switch to global neoliberalization because I wanted to actually insist on the fact that neoliberalization is a process, and one that doesn't go unchallenged and that remains incomplete. Hence, global neoliberalization. And for me, international financial institutions like the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank exemplify the combination of dispersal and centralization that characterizes global neoliberalization. And so my argument is that since the 1970s, the politics of structural adjustment programs, austerity measures, privatization, and precarity have created a common, not an identical, but an analogous social context across various Atlantic Rim nations that support a plurilingual study of the Atlantic world, right? And so what I've seen in the works that I analyze is that they're inviting and they're also trying to produce a cross-cultural analysis of neoliberal precarity, right? Now, this is, of course, a tricky task for them and for me. And, you know, the tricky thing being, you know, how do you think about these things transnationally and, you know, across cultures without sort of erasing local and historical differences, right? And so this challenge happens at two levels. It happens within the novels themselves, where what we often see is that characters are moving between various locations and they're trying, and often failing, to build various forms of transnational solidarity, right? And then at the level of the book, so at the level of Precarious Crossings, I propose a multilingual Atlantic framework which identifies aesthetic and political similarities across different national contexts without, while remaining attentive to local differences, right? And to also to racialized and gendered modes of neoliberal marginalization. And that's not, you know, it's not an easy thing to do. So, but that's what I tried to do. And
this way.
Oh, right. Thank you, George. And actually, my comparative model is based on a quote from Fred Moten from a book called The Undercommons, which I really like, which, because of the language, I will not read out loud, but you can read it. So really, the way I like to rephrase this is, this system is killing us all, just some much more softly than others, right? Or this system is killing us all, but at very different speeds. And so to me, the challenge, but also the necessary task, and something that I do believe that comparative literature can help us with, is to understand both how the system is killing us all, and also how it's killing us at very different speeds, right? And this is why I choose to frame the work around the concept of neoliberal precarity, because I think it can be at the basis of a coalition that challenges every instance of the devaluation of life, but while also engaging in a serious analysis of how and why certain lives are more devalued than others, right? So I'm trying not to mobilize precarity as a way to ignore or supersede difference, but really to think of it as a characteristic that's differentially assigned according to race, gender, class, nationality, but also as a site of potential solidarity. And again, this to me is a very important, though perhaps impossible, task, because I do believe that given its global extent, only a multilingual and transnational approach can really challenge neoliberalism, right? So the different forms of multiculturalism within specific national frameworks are insufficient because they do not account adequately for the transnational dimensions of neoliberal production and subject formation, right? And also that neither are monolingual transnational approaches, because neoliberal governance mobilizes racialized and gendered modes of marginalization to prevent solidarity between groups, right? So it kind of forces different groups to compete for state and international protection, which is only ever extended in limited ways. And so what I try to show is how the narratives, these contemporary narratives, challenge this logic, and how they're considering precarity in the context of global neoliberalization, but they're considering how it operates in differential but complementary ways across race, gender, sexuality, and national belonging to sustain global neoliberalization. Now, a question, of course, that comes up often is, okay, but why think about this through literature? Right? So why use literature to think about these economic and political questions? And I mean, I do rely on literary theory a lot, but there's also like a lot of economic theory in the book and some political science. And so what is the point of, doing this through literature? And I try to make the case that it's a worthwhile endeavor, but not because literary works just simply illustrate what social scientists have hypothesized, right? So what I try to not simply use literary work as evidence for pre-existing theories, right? What I try to show is that literary works do not simply reproduce the work we live in, they theorize it, but they also recreate it. And then they raise questions and look at issues from angles that other disciplines may not, and that in that way they can be a gateway towards interdisciplinary conversations, right? Now, of course, at the same time, these are aesthetic objects and they pose certain aesthetic questions about representation, genre, and form. And so they challenge us, literary critics, to move in different directions and to think of new frameworks. But also, I think that they offer us what I call lines of flight. So ways of reimagining social relations outside of the logic of global neoliberalization. And they do this from a multinational perspective. Now, I wanted to show everyone a little bit what are the different novels, well, they're not all novels, but what are the different works that I analyzed, precisely because it is a very, right, I will get it by the end of this presentation. It is a very heterogeneous corpus. And so the first chapter is called The Atlantic Revisited. And I look at three works, one by Franco-Senegalese Sylvie Condé. It's a neo-epic poem that's called The Infinite Quest for the Other Shore. And I look at a novel by Guadeloupean author Maryse Condé, The Story of the Cannibal Woman, and a work by a Quichean British author Carol Phillips, The Atlantic Sound. And here what I'm really interested is the superposition in the works between the questions of contemporary migration and circulations of capital and goods and the memory of slavery and the Atlantic trade. So on the one hand, the way that the authors are inviting us to historicize global neoliberalization, but also pointing to new connections and new identifications that are emerging in light of very contemporary economic and political transformations. And then, I almost did it. I was gonna say I did it, but I went the other way. Okay. The indebted immigrant. So the chapter focuses on the creation of precarious indebted immigrant workers in the global neoliberal economy through a reading of two novels by a Franco-Senegalese writer, Fatou Diom. So The Belly of the Atlantic and Women Who Wait. And first, what I was interested in here is the way that the entry of new immigrant destinations like Italy and Spain complicates the post-colonial relationship between France and Senegal. But also how in traveling and thinking between these different poles, the characters encounter indebtedness as an increasingly transatlantic condition. And this happens in different ways. In The Belly of the Atlantic, Diom considers debt through the character of Moussa, who is a Senegalese soccer player recruited by a French team who then has to repay a debt to his recruiter. And in The Women Who Wait, what's interesting is that immigration is actually considered from the point of view of those who stay, right? So, namely, women who are waiting for the return of their husbands and sons. And as the original breadwinners have left, women often have to resort to debt to survive. But really also what I'm interested in here is how neoliberal debt operates both at a macroeconomic level and at the level of subject formation. So what is happening is that indebted countries beget indebted local and immigrant subjects. And she's analyzing the superposition of the different dimensions of debt. So how leaving indebted countries, immigrants often finance their trips through debt, only to be then told that they owe the new country for the opportunity to live there. And at the same time, they have a debt towards those that they left behind, which is expected to be repaid in the form of remittances, right? So in this chapter, really, immigrant debt is what connects the global south and the global north. And it becomes, or I try to position it as a new lens for conceptualizing the globalized Atlantic, right? And I'm looking at ways in which characters both position themselves in relation to the global debt system, but also the ways in which the system never circumscribes their experiences fully. So the ways that they point to also modes of relating that exceed the logic of debt and precarity. Yes, okay. That's what I wanted. Thank you. It only took 6 slides. Okay. How to Get Away with Murder, Multinational Corporation and Atlantic Crimes. I look at 2 very different novels. One is by a Swiss-Gabonese author, Bessorat, and the novel is called Petroleum, and the other one is by Chilean Roberto Bolaño, 2666. But there is one thing that brings these 2 narratives together, which was of particular interest to me, and that is that multinational corporations are at the center of detective mysteries. Why was this interesting to me? Well, first of all, because multinationals exemplified the complex relationship between the national and the transnational in the age of global neoliberalization. So operating within, but also beyond and across countries, they increasingly challenge national sovereignty, pointing to transnational circuits of corporate power, right? So focusing on multinationals, both authors address the violences of global neoliberalization, but they also strain against the literary conventions of crime fiction, fashioning what I call the neoliberal anti-detective novel. And I call it the anti-detective novel because neoliberal crimes exceed the objectives of the traditional detective and the capacities of a traditional... They exceed the objectives of the traditional detective novel and the capacities of a traditional investigator, right? Because they keep trying to find, like, the guy who did it. Or women, but, the person who did it. But the problem is that the culprit is the status quo. So, in the way, the anti-detective novel is trying to deal with very complex questions of accountability, responsibility, and guilt in this context where the culprit is the status quo. And so here, the various Atlantic nodes are rhizomatically connected through Atlantic crimes that remain unsolved. Opacity, I know that Yolanda likes this one, opacity and transatlantic citizenship. So here, I'm looking at 3 authors. A French author, Marine Dye, and her novel Rosicard, a Puerto Rican author, Yolanda Arroyo Pizarro, and Novela, The Documented, and then a Mexican author, Yuri Herrera, and a novel, Signs Preceding the End of the World. And here what interests me is how the authors are resorting to an aesthetics and ethics of opacity as a means of representing precarious subjects. So what is happening is that the characters in these works are very opaque and impenetrable. So they're offering us no ground of identification. But this lack of character depth is replaced by a breadth. So the novels do not try to depict a complex interior, but are rather focusing on the protagonist's constant movement through different geographical locations. So in other words, instead of trying to explain their characters, they're tracing the interconnectedness of these very opaque lives, right? And so I bring here opacity in conversation with two other terms, which are refusal and disidentification. And I look at how the novels move away from a more traditional model where ethics stems from an identification with the character, but here really the reader is invited to disidentify from a world where the privilege of some depends on the precarity of others. And so here, the globalized Atlantic I conceptualize through intersecting acts of withholding and refusal. And then there's one more, and then we're done, which is Atlantic Undercommons. And here I look at only one work because it's a very complex one, called United States of Banana, which is an allegorical multi-genre work by Puerto Rican writer Janina Braschi. And the main plot line, if one can call it such at all, deals with three characters, Janina, Zarathustra, and Hamlet, in their attempt to liberate Segismundo from the dungeon under the skirt of Lady Liberty. So it's very allegorical. And Segismundo, who's an allegorical representation of Puerto Rico, was imprisoned there at birth by his father. But actually what interests me is that in Lady Liberty's skirt, in the dungeon, he encounters a lot of prisoners of war, so-called terrorists. And the way that different solidarities emerge between these characters out of a mutual or a shared condition of political precarity. Political precarity precisely in the context of indefinite detention in the context of a state of emergency, right? And so in ways I think this work is a linguistic and philosophical revolt of those who have been stripped of their rights in the context of the global state of emergency. So this is what I look at there. So those are the works I look at, and that's how the book is organized. And I wanted to finish by I wanted to read a few paragraphs from the introduction, which are actually it's the one time in the introduction that I get a little personal. But also because I try to explain really why I feel very strongly about the need to think comparatively and transnationally in the age of global neoliberalization. So, okay, here it goes. I come from the Balkans, from the area now commonly known as ex-Yugoslavia, though I still refer to myself as Yugoslav. I lived in France when I was younger, and I pursued most of my studies in the United States, graduating with a PhD in Francophone Studies and a comparative focus on Latin America. I often have to justify my strange and unusual choice. Why would someone from the Balkans be interested in the Francophone Caribbean? My students are often surprised and perplexed. They would be more comfortable with a professor from the Caribbean because then they could rely on their cultural authenticity. Someone from the United States would also be acceptable, since Americans have an imperial duty to study the rest of the world. Those of us from the global South have two options: work on our own regions and serve as contemporary versions of a native informant, or study Western literature and culture due to its assumed universality. This is of course not a rule, and there are plenty of exceptions aside from myself, but it is nonetheless, as many readers will recognize, often the case. It is significantly less common for individuals from the Global South to show interest and have knowledge of other countries of the Global South. Even though our context shares similarities, because we occupy a similar position in the current organization of capital, because most of us have gone through structural adjustment programs, are familiar with neoliberalism, austerity, deregulation, and privatization. In this book, I support these lateral interests and lateral connections. As much as I support the choice that someone from the Balkans be interested in the Francophone Caribbean, I advocate for a dialogue between Latin American, African, and Caribbean writers. These interchanges for me have important ethical and political implications. Beginning in the 1990s, Yugoslavia went through a brutal civil war and a violent economic restructuring guided by forced privatizations, austerity measures, market liberalization, and heightened unemployment. When I was visiting what was no longer Yugoslavia sometime in the mid-2000s, I had an interesting conversation with a friend who was appalled that the transition government would raise taxes on local materials and lower taxes on imports, eventually destroying local production in favor of foreign products. She was perplexed by this decision and asked me whether I could believe it. I, in fact, could, because I was very familiar with structural adjustment programs and neoliberal policies in other countries of the global south. I knew what Mexico, Jamaica, Senegal, and so many other countries had gone through, and it was analogous. Had we in the Balkans had the opportunity to learn about these countries, maybe we could have predicted our future. However, the pervading assumption is that because of cultural differences, we do not have much in common, even though historically this is not true. The works in my corpus move against this assumption as they identify precarity to be an increasingly transatlantic condition. Following these narratives, I strive to build a multilingual Atlantic framework. Precarious crossings exist at the intersection of Francophone, Anglophone, Latin American, post-colonial, and economic studies. I ask the reader for some patience as I weave between these different fields to tell the story of a globalized literary Atlantic. Thank you.
We have some time for questions.
Yeah. Not all at once. Yeah,
I
go
have
ahead.
a question. I was just taken by your very last sentence where you mentioned Anglophone, Francophone, and Latin American.
Uh-huh.
How do you define Latin America in terms of, you're talking about sort of linguistic worlds vis-a-vis regionals, or, and Latin America has obviously more than one language.
Right.
So,
And I
was
mean,
just like,
yeah, and
I'm sorry, just a biggie.
yeah, and I mean, I don't work in Latin America at large. I work on certain authors, who come from certain Latin American countries and work in Spanish or write in Spanish, but really also I work mostly on authors whose novels or works, they're not all novels, do not take place in the country that they're from. So what I'm interested in is, for instance, a Guadeloupean novelist who sets her novel in South Africa, right? And so, what do we do with that novel, right? Is that Francophone? Yes, it's written in French, but again, we're in South Africa with a bunch of characters who come from all over. And so what I try to say is precisely versus thinking in regional terms, we should look at these novels who do that together. But that doesn't mean, of course, and I'm not trying to say, I'm not trying to say at all like, so we shouldn't be using other models at all, or like the regional models are no longer valid. I'm just saying that that I'm interested in these works that exceed the regional and that exceed the monolingual, and to try to think, okay, so what do we do with them? How can we think beyond regions and beyond languages?
No, my observation was a very simple one.
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, you inspired me.
It was just about you refer precisely. The Anglophone is a trans-regional, transnational concept, and so is Francophone.
Oh,
When
right.
you talk about Latin American,
I say Latin American, not Hispanophone.
or
Yeah.
Lusophone, or
Yeah, well, because I think like the Latin America still sort of remains more. Hispanophone is less used than Francophone and Anglophone, but that is something definitely that I was thinking about and sort of wondering
or
whether.
Lusophone, which is half the size of the South
Right,
American country.
right, and Lusophone does appear.
Yeah.
And
Oh, in Africa too.
Yes,
Right.
that's right.
right,
But anyway, that was just
yeah.
I wonder if, as you were working on this project, and I'm thinking about your other work in Occupy, whether or not the experiences of non-Global South experience of precarity, if you thought about them and how, in literature, let's say, and how they relate to Global South writers. I mean, because there are these experiences in the quote-unquote Global North, not necessarily from people of Global South extraction. So I'm just wondering how you, I know you didn't talk about that, but you did tell me that there's something about Occupy in the conclusion.
Yeah, there is something about Occupy in the conclusion. I mean, I think this book is very inspired by my experience in Occupy and I mean, in other organizing circles, and partially because, you know, one of the main phrases of Occupy was all our grievances are connected, right? But a big question throughout was also, well, what does it mean, and also like how do we put this in practice? And you know, and also Occupy was of course very influenced by the Arab Spring, and then by what was happening in Spain. You know, and a lot of people from different countries, both of the Global North and the South, were coming to Zuccotti Park. And so, you know, and the question was always the same in these workshops. It was sort of like how, like, we're all like noticing that we have these, you know, we're dealing with similar issues. We want to learn from one another, but how do we do this without simply sort of translating models, right? So we can't sort of ignore certain local differences. We can't just like import, you know, it's not going to work to just like take, you know, the Spanish model and just like put it in New York. So, and yet, you know, we're feeling that like we're dealing with the same things, we just don't know how to do it. And that to me is the question of comparative thinking. It's sort of like, and it's a question of what it means to be in coalition and in solidarity, right? It's a question of, well, how do we learn from one another? Like, how can we think across these differences and build across differences without sort of erasing differences, you know? Now, in terms of the Global North, well, I mean, that's related with the whole thing of like, what do we think about, what do we mean by the Global South, right? And the whole like Global North, Global South division, right? And I mean, the Global North, Global South division has kind of come to replace the first Third World division to talk about the uneven accumulation of capital, right? But there are people, it gets complicated, right? Because the Global North is supposed to indicate sort of the Northern Hemisphere where there's like more resources and capital, you know, versus the Southern Hemisphere that's like composed of more marginalized nations. And I think in the age of global neoliberalization, it actually becomes very complicated, because I do think that the neoliberal elite is actually composed of, you know, people both from the South and the North, and also that certain communities in the Global North, particularly communities of color, are facing very similar levels of marginalization as those in the Global South. So the way I use it, following some other people, is more as a metaphorical division to really talk about the uneven accumulation of capital across the globe, right? But not necessarily one that fits perfectly with the geographical division between the southern and the northern hemisphere.
Okay, so my question is about your work on comparative literature and your take on the political aspects of that kind of work. And in particular, because I'm thinking about, you don't necessarily talk about the decolonial take on comparative literature, so I want to know more, because the last chapter of the book is beautiful, people should read it. But I wanted you to tell us a little bit more about that project.
About the last chapter?
Yes, and how do you take, you sort of like make a stand on how you do the work of comparative work without erasing differences, but not necessarily going into the decolonial kind of like approach?
Yeah, I don't go into the decolonial approach, honestly, for a very silly reason, which is that, I mean, this project was already so huge from the beginning that, you know, many times throughout it, I was like, this is just like a megalomaniac, like crazy sort of thing to try to do. and I'm drawing from economic theory and from all of these different traditions, and I had to make certain choices, right? And so the decolonial is there for sure, in the sense particularly the way I think it's really important to also to acknowledge, and I think the works that I do that precarity is not a new thing, right? And so it's very important to acknowledge that precarity has a very long historical tradition, right? And to think about the precarity of the enslaved and the colonized, and that's why I actually decided to sort of preserve the Atlantic as a framework, because I think, well, it's important for many of the authors I work on, for some more explicitly, like Fatou Diom, whose novel is called The Belly of the Atlantic, but that the Atlantic really sort of gives us also this longer historical perspective on precarity, right? And sort of positioning the Atlantic as an important site for the formation of capitalism sort of since the 16th century, and then sort of neoliberalism kind of becoming the more recent phase for it. So to return to your question, I think that's where this kind of historical connection, the sort of the remnants of, colonialism, which, one could say the sort of the coloniality is still there. That's where the decolonial comes in for me, even though not always so explicitly.
So I thought the part that you read was really poignant in its speculative nature, right? The kind of speculation about if this conversation could have taken place laterally across the global south, what could have happened. So I was wondering if you can maybe talk about instances in the book where the conversation did happen and what happened.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of, there are different instances. One that I particularly love is in Sylvie Condé's neo-epic poem, The Infinite Quest of the Other Shore. And it's actually, the book spans various centuries. But in the first song, she's imagining a Malian expedition to the Americas. And for instance, there's this moment where actually the Malian expedition, there's different, in the different songs, there's different endings to the story. But in one of the endings, the Malian expedition actually arrives to the America and encounters Native American population. And then after a lot of kind of battling of the wills, they manage to cohabit. And so, for instance, it's this whole imagining of a different history that could have been, right? That sort of circumvents European colonialism. And we don't know, maybe European colonialism would have still happened, but it's this very, it's one of the kind of new Atlantic connections that I'm interested in. And then another one is also that I really like, which happens, someone who inspired me a lot is actually Carol Phillips. And in some of his essays, well, he talks about different things. He talks about how growing up in England, it was actually the people who were on his side were these weird white Eastern European teachers who sort of supported him in England, and he just couldn't figure out why. And sort of he felt this kind of solidarity, but he couldn't fully understand it. And then he has another moment in another story where there's a Pakistani boy who arrives to his school and he's being bullied, and he sort of instinctually wants to kind of be on his side. But then again, the friendship never develops because of the cultural differences, and the sort of the racial differences. So there's a lot of also in his work, there's a lot of these moments of kind of potential solidarities that at moments are realized, but also cannot be fully realized, right? Or don't have the framework. He doesn't have the framework for realizing them. And that was sort of also one of the questions for me, the initial questions, well, what would be those frameworks? What would have allowed for those friendships to become fully realized?
And what are those frameworks?
Well, I think,
Buy the book.
yeah. I think, I mean, the framework I propose is very simple. It's the one I showed, which is, the system is killing us all, just at very different speeds. So it's going to end up killing us all because it's killing the planet, right? But it also doesn't mean that it's killing us all in the same way. So, And so, to me, the framework is learning to work with both. The way that we need to think about these, like, across differences because, it is killing us all. And also the way, to sort of acknowledge that we also need to acknowledge different forms of privilege, right? That often make these kind of coalitions and solidarities difficult.
I think we have time for one more question.
Sure. How about two more?
Well, I can barely distill this, but it's evocative what you're saying. And I like the image of precarity being opposite to some other thing, which is comfortable power or something, and that in the past maybe cycles in time could kind of mediate that a little bit. It wasn't the Queen of England could declare a jubilee year in which debts are forgiven.
Yeah.
And that was globally synchronized relief from this.
Yeah.
And instead, maybe as it gets all globalized, in the globalized world, are all the tourniquets just tightening at the same time, absolutely everywhere? Is that just not the grimmest thing? And do we need some way for the world to have cycles? Or can there just be little micro cycles here and there, just a little slack? Because as you say, there's suffering on the power side as well as on the powerless side of these relations. And I just wonder, I know you're more about describing the past, and this is, but dare you mention a future vision for us of wither precarity? All right, I'll shut up.
Yeah. I mean, I have a lot to say about that. So I don't know. Well, the Jubilee, not just the Queen, but also the Bible. Actually, in the Old Testament, the Jubilee happens every 50 years, and it's a time where all the debts are raised. So there's definitely been a lot of people who have been calling for a Jubilee. I was actually part of the project that was called the Rolling Jubilee.
Yeah.
So people have definitely been calling for the Jubilee to come back, particularly, for instance, in relation to student debt. So that's one. In terms of cycles...
Tell it to the vultures, though. This is the year you lose your shirt.
Yeah. In terms of... in terms of the... powerful also suffering, I guess, what I will say is that I often think that the neoliberal elite is the worst elite in the history because they're also working themselves to death.
Right.
So it's this sort of the logic of productivity and efficiency has taken over to such an extent that even those who oppress others are also working themselves to death. You know what I mean? At least historically, aristocracies, they had other people to work for them so they could go hunting or horseback riding. But this is a very bizarre moment to me where CEOs are also working 36 hours a day. So yeah, it's just but I think it's just the extent to which the ideology of efficiency and progress and productivity has taken over to such an extent that they're consuming themselves along with all of us and the planet. And then in terms of cycles, I do think we are. I do think there are cycles. I mean, in the last chapter, I rely a lot on Emmanuel Wallerstein and the idea that we're in an age of transition, and I think we are actually in an age of transition. I do think that neoliberalism is facing a big crisis, though capitalism goes through kind of crisis and cycles. I think that sort of where it's going to go depends on us. Right now, frankly, it doesn't look great in terms of what's going to replace it, but I don't think it's final. And again, I think that's why we really do need to learn to think about across differences, because we really need to learn how to build coalitions, because otherwise, yeah, I don't know. We'll see what happens.
So, second final question.
Alexandra, I wondered if you might be willing to share with us a little bit about the creative process behind this book. If I could steer your answer a little bit. So I'm trying to think, you'd read all these books before. You had, over your lifetime, developed a set of ideas about how the world works. You thought, I'm going to put those together. Or you had a set of ideas about how the world works and you started reading and collecting. Are there 50 books that didn't make it into the corpus? How did you select what goes in, what goes out?
Right.
Which came first, the ideas, the books? What was that creative process like?
It was a very long and painful process. No, I'm joking, but it was a very long process because this is based on my PhD dissertation. No, I think the way it started, I mean, I was always interested in questions of immigration, and I had been reading immigration narratives since I moved to France when I was in high school, and I think it's just realizing that the more contemporary works I was reading, that there was a shift. So there were no longer the kind of narratives I was used to, which are really the kind of Bildungsroman, a lot of the coming of age stories of what it means to be an immigrant in a specific national framework. And that there was something else that was happening. There was like another set of questions. They were much like broader. They were happening across multiple national spaces. In terms of defining the corpus, yeah, I mean, that wasn't easy, but and also it's not, and I don't claim that this is a definite corpus. You know what I mean? I think it would be impossible to claim something like that. I really, I think of it more as a kind of first step to sort of being able to just establish some multilingual conversations.
Well, let me just end by saying that the book is purchasable over there. I'm sure Alexandra will be happy to sign it, and the autograph will be worth millions.
Yeah, I'm sure.
It's a cycle. But speaking of conversations, let's give a round of applause and we can have.
That was great. I always admire the way you guys talk without reading. It's like, what? Do that. I know, but you pretend you're not. I was like, I couldn't see it. I couldn't see it. Like, okay, wait.